Number no one wanted this cat. For 2 years, then a DNA test changed everything. For 2 full years, the cat in cage 37 was never chosen, not once. In the front rooms of the Maplewood Animal Shelter, in a quiet Ohio town, dozens of cats moved through in waves kittens that left within hours. Older tabbies claimed by retired couples, even a one-eyed tomcat who found a home before his intake paperwork dried. The shelter was never empty for long. Adoption days brought strollers and children pressed against glass, whole families searching for the right face to bring home. But no face ever settled on him. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't hiss or scratch or throw himself against the cage door. He wasn't sickly or visibly injured. By every standard measure, he was a healthy, medium-sized gray cat with pale green eyes and a coat that, when the morning light came in from the east-facing windows, caught a faint silver sheen. He was, by most definitions, a beautiful animal. And yet something about him made people uneasy. The moment anyone approached his enclosure, the cat would do something that felt almost deliberate. He would turn away. Not out of fear, his body remained relaxed, his tail low and still, but with a kind of composure that felt closer to refusal than to shyness. He wouldn't meet eyes. If a visitor crouched down and made soft sounds to coax him forward, he would shift his weight toward the far corner of the enclosure and stay there, facing the back wall. Then, sometimes, he would make a sound. It wasn't a meow. It wasn't a hiss. It was something between a trill and a low, rhythmic call, the kind of sound that seemed addressed to someone just out of frame, just around a corner that didn't exist. People would lean in, confused, then pull back. Some laughed nervously. Most just moved on to the next cage. The staff at Maplewood started calling him Ghost Cat. Not as a term of endearment, more as a way of explaining him when they couldn't. He's just Ghost. One of the longer-tenured volunteers would say when new people asked. He doesn't really connect. He's just there. He had been surrendered in the autumn, brought in by animal control with no identifying tag, no microchip, no documentation, just a cat found outside a residential neighborhood on the east side of town, disoriented, alone. 2 years later, he was still in the same building, still in a cage not far from the same wall. No one had thought to ask why. 2 years is a long time to be overlooked. By the time Ghost had spent his first full year at Maplewood, a quiet, observable pattern had settled over every interaction he had with the public. It wasn't dramatic. There were no scenes, no outbursts. It was something more like a steady, invisible wall that no one had built and no one knew how to take down. On average, the shelter received more than 200 visitors during peak adoption months, weekends in spring and early summer, when families arrived in the mood for something new. By the most conservative count, over the course of 2 years, Ghost Cat had been passed by somewhere near 500 people. Some stopped for a few seconds. A handful lingered, curious. A small number of visitors had been persistent enough to sit with him for several minutes, murmuring low and patient, hoping for a signal. Every attempt ended the same way. He would acknowledge the presence of a person, his ears would rotate slightly, his posture would adjust, and then he would do nothing. He didn't move toward the door. He didn't reach a paw through the bars. He didn't press his nose to the latch the way some of the other cats did, the ones who had learned that fingers near the cage meant a chance at contact. Ghost sat where he was and redirected his attention to a point somewhere slightly above and beyond the person in front of him, as though someone more important was expected to come through the door at any moment. It was the waiting that got to people. Not the rejection, exactly, but the specific quality of his waiting, as if they were already a disappointment he had anticipated. One couple who had been seriously considering him, a man named David and his wife, Karen, who had been looking for a companion for their elderly tabby, sat with Ghost for 20 minutes on a Saturday afternoon. Karen spoke softly to him the entire time. Ghost remained in his corner. At one point he made the low trill sound, briefly, and tilted his head toward the hallway. Then he turned back to the wall. David told the staff afterward that it felt like the cat was waiting for someone who wasn't coming. He meant it as an explanation. He didn't know he was exactly right. Meanwhile, 2 young volunteers who had been at the shelter longer than Ghost himself began discussing, quietly, whether the staff should reconsider his adoption status. He wasn't dangerous, but was he adoptable? The question had started to feel uncomfortable to ask. He just sat in his corner, day after day, facing the same direction. And inside that stillness, something was moving, something patient and persistent that no one had thought to name. Emily Carter arrived at Maplewood on a Wednesday morning in late February, her first official shift as a new volunteer. She was 29, recently relocated from Columbus for a job in healthcare administration, and she had signed up for shelter work the way some people take up running, looking for something that asked something real of her. She had been given the standard orientation, the laminated folder with cage protocols, feeding charts, and reminders about not overstimulating animals in intake. Her supervisor, a practical woman named Denise, walked her through the rooms quickly. There were 17 cats in residence that week. Denise pointed out which ones were easy, which ones needed slow introductions, which ones were already in the process of being claimed. Emily listened and took notes. Then they passed cage 37. Denise didn't stop walking. "That's Ghost," she said, the same way someone might indicate a piece of broken furniture in the corner of a storage room. "He's been here a while. You don't need to do much with him, just the standard feeding check. He doesn't really respond to interaction." Emily looked in. The gray cat sat in the far corner, slightly angled away, his eyes directed at nothing visible. The posture was calm, almost studied in its calm. She noticed that he wasn't tense, his shoulders weren't raised, his ears weren't pinned. He wasn't afraid, he just wasn't interested. Except she wasn't entirely sure that was the right word for it. She stayed behind after Denise had moved on. She didn't reach through the bars. She didn't make sounds. She simply crouched down until she was at cage level and positioned herself about 2 feet from the door, and she waited. For about 4 minutes, nothing happened. Ghost remained in his corner. Then, without any visible trigger, he shifted. Not all the way around. Not toward her exactly, but a partial turn, his chin lifting slightly, his body rotating a degree or two in her general direction before stopping, as if he had caught something in the air and then thought better of pursuing it. He didn't look at her, but he didn't turn further away. It was a small thing. Emily might have dismissed it. She didn't. Over the next 3 weeks, Emily returned to cage 37 every shift she worked. She kept the same practice. She would position herself nearby without pressure, without extended reach, without the slow, crooning voice that most visitors instinctively fell into. She simply existed in proximity to the cat and let him do whatever he was going to do. She began keeping a small notebook. What she wrote in it was not what she had expected. Ghost's behavior, when observed across multiple sessions without the filter of wanting something from him, turned out to be anything but random. He wasn't checked out. He wasn't numb from shelter fatigue, the glazed indifference that long-term shelter animals sometimes developed. He was, in fact, intensely responsive, but only to specific things. He reacted to sound, not all sounds. Not the general ambient noise of the shelter, the distant barking, the ventilation hum, the carts rolling over tile. Those he ignored entirely, but specific tonal patterns pulled him out of his corner in visible, physical ways. Certain voices, certain pitches. A staff member named Marcus, who had a low, resonant laugh, could be 3 rooms away, and Ghost would pivot toward the hallway. A radio playing through a wall, when a female announcer switched from news cadence to a warmer, softer register, made Ghost stand up from a full rest position and approach the door. Once, a woman with a young daughter walked through the hall without stopping at his cage, and Ghost pressed his full body against the cage door for the first time Emily had ever seen him do it. He watched them pass. When they were gone, he made his trill sound 3 times in a row, each one slightly louder before going back to his corner. And then there was the mimicry. Emily had not expected this, but on the 4th week of her observation, she was sitting near the cage eating a granola bar and speaking quietly on the phone with her sister. She finished the call, said, "Okay, love you, bye," and set the phone down. About 90 seconds later, from inside the cage, Ghost made a sound that was not the words, but the rhythm and the cadence, almost precisely the shape of her closing phrase. She looked up from her notebook. He was looking directly at the door, not at her, but at the door. Not everyone at Maplewood found Emily's observations compelling. The shelter's head veterinary technician, a careful man named Robert Hale, had documented Ghost extensively when he first arrived. The notes in Ghost's file mentioned standard health markers, all within normal range, and a behavioral flag: avoidant, possibly stress, reactive, not recommended for home with young children or high-stimulus environments. That flag had been renewed every 6 months. It was nearly 4 pages of careful, professional language, and all of it pointed in the same direction. "Sometimes they just don't adjust," Robert told Emily when she came to him with her notebook. He said it without unkindness. 2 years in a shelter environment is a long time. Animals can develop patterns that are essentially neurological at that point. They're not choosing, it's just what their system does. Another volunteer who had been at Maplewood for 5 years, a woman named Patrice, was more direct. She'd seen Ghost go through 2 different rounds of behavioral evaluation. There was talk once about transferring him to a sanctuary facility, she told Emily. Somewhere he'd have space and low contact. Some animals are just better that way. She paused. He's not suffering. He's just not a pet. Emily didn't argue, but she went back to her notebook. There was something she couldn't square. Everything she had been told about Ghost, the behavioral assessments, the informal staff consensus, the patient and well-meaning advice from people who knew more about shelter animals than she did, described a cat defined by what he lacked: responsiveness, social instinct, adaptability, connection. But what she had spent a month watching wasn't an absence of those things. It was a misalignment of them. She lay awake on a Thursday night and turned the distinction over. Absence meant nothing was there. Misalignment meant it was there just aimed at the wrong target, or rather, at a target that wasn't present. The next morning, she came back to the shelter before her shift officially started and asked to review Ghost's full intake records. The intake file was thin. Ghost had been brought in by animal control on a Tuesday in early October, 2 years prior. The report noted a residential street on the east side of town, a stretch of older houses, some rental properties, a mix of families and single occupants. The cat had been found outdoors, apparently alone, showing signs of having been without food for several days, but otherwise in stable condition. No collar, no chip, no reports in the lost and found registry matching his description. That was the entirety of the known record. Emily read it twice. Then she thought about everything she had observed: the specific sound tracking, the reaction to particular vocal registers, the mimicry, the pressing against the door when the woman and her daughter passed. She thought about the low trill that sounded like a call directed at someone just out of range. None of that was the behavior of a feral animal. Feral cats were conflict avoiders who had never learned to associate humans with safety. They flinched. They fled. They didn't mimic human cadence or track voices through walls with the focus of an animal searching for something familiar. Ghost wasn't feral. He had been someone's cat, and whatever had separated him from that home, whether displacement, accident, or loss, had not removed the expectation. He was still operating as though the people he knew were somewhere nearby, as though the right sound from the right direction would resolve things. Emily spent 2 days researching breed-linked behavioral traits in domestic cats. What she found made her more certain. Then she made an appointment with a veterinary genetics service and brought it to Robert Hale. She asked permission to run a DNA test. Robert looked at her for a long moment. "It won't change anything about his adoptability assessment," he said. "I know," said Emily. "I want to understand him better." Robert approved it. The swab was sent on a Friday. The results were expected in 10 to 14 business days. Emily told herself she wouldn't fixate on the wait. She spent the next 2 weeks doing exactly that. In the days between the swab and the results, Emily kept returning to Ghost's cage in the mornings before the shelter opened to the public. The quiet of that early hour, just the sounds of animals settling, the occasional creak of the building, the muffled noise of traffic from the street, seemed to agree with him. She began bringing a small recording device. Not to provoke him, just to document. She played ambient tracks through a low speaker, street noise, kitchen sounds, the general texture of a house in daytime. Ghost would sit in his corner and listen with something close to patience. Then she found an online archive of children's voices, educational content, audiobooks, a recording of a child reading from a beginning reader about a dog who learned to swim. She played it at low volume through the speaker outside his cage. Ghost stood up within 7 seconds. He walked, not rushed, not frantic, but with a kind of purposeful ease she had not seen before, directly to the front of the cage and stood there. His tail moved in slow arcs. His ears were forward. His eyes tracked the speaker with the full, focused attention of an animal listening for a word it recognized. He made the trill sound once, soft. Then he sat down in front of the cage door and stayed there. Emily sat on the floor across from him and let the recording run. For 30 minutes, Ghost Cat sat at the front of his cage. He did not press against the bars. He did not call out again. He simply stayed as close to the source of the voice as he could get, in the quiet way of something that had waited a very long time and had learned not to expect too much from any single moment. When Emily finally stopped the recording and stood up to leave, Ghost watched her go. Just before she reached the hallway door, she heard the trill sound again once, very low. She wrote in her notebook, "Asterisk, he is not waiting for any person. He is waiting for a specific person, someone small." Asterisk. The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday, 11 business days after the swab had been sent. Emily opened the email at her desk at work, on her lunch break, and read it 3 times before she called Robert Hale. The test had identified Ghost as a Siberian Forest Cat, not a common household tabby, but a breed with a documented genetic lineage going back to the cats of northern Russia brought to North America in the late 1980s. Siberian cats were known for several traits that distinguished them sharply from the average domestic cat. Unusually high social bonding, long-term memory for individual humans, and a pronounced sensitivity to vocal and emotional cues that made them behave less like typical cats and more like animals that had evolved specifically to live in close partnership with people. But it was the second finding that stopped Emily cold. The genetic profile indicated that Ghost had not spent his early life outdoors. His cellular stress markers, his bone density, his coat development, all of them pointed to an animal that had been raised entirely indoors, in a stable domestic environment, from the time he was very young. The analysis noted something else. Siberian cats bonded with primary caretakers with a depth and specificity that was unusual even among social breeds. They remembered. They oriented. They formed emotional anchors that were, in the language of the report, resistant to substitution. A footnote in the analysis described a documented behavioral phenomenon in the breed. When separated from a primary bonded person, Siberians had been observed to engage in acoustic searching, vocalizing in patterns that matched the voice signatures of the person they had lost, sometimes for months, sometimes longer. Emily read that sentence twice. Acoustic searching, the trill, the mimicry, the pivot toward certain voices, the pressing against the door when a child and her mother walked by. 2 years of sitting in the same corner, facing the same direction, calling in a frequency that no one in the building had ever belonged to. Ghost wasn't a broken cat. He wasn't stress damaged, or neurologically impaired, or simply too feral to adapt. He was a deeply bonded animal who had lost his person, almost certainly a child, given his reaction profile, and had spent 2 years in a building full of strangers, none of whom were the one he was listening for. He had been doing the only thing he knew how to do. He had been waiting. The afternoon, Emily shared the results with Robert and Patrice and the rest of the Maplewood staff. The room went quiet in the way it does when something that had been visible all along is finally named correctly. Robert sat with the report for a long time. He read the section on acoustic searching twice. Then he set it down and said nothing for almost a full minute. "We thought he was unreachable," Patrice said finally. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. "We thought he just didn't have it in him." Emily didn't say anything either. She had been thinking about all the descriptions she'd heard over 2 years. Not her own 2 years, but his. Avoidant. Not recommended. Just not a pet. Every label that had accumulated around him had been built from the outside, from what he wasn't giving, rather than from what he was carrying. He hadn't been withdrawn. He had been faithful. To a bond that no longer had a destination. To a voice that the world around him had stopped producing. The behavioral assessment in his file would need to be rewritten. More than that, the entire framework of what Ghost Cat needed had shifted. He wasn't an animal who required lower stimulation or quieter conditions or more distance from human contact. He needed the opposite. He needed the right kind of contact. Specifically calibrated, specifically patient. He needed to be slowly introduced to the idea that connection was possible again, that the thing he had been listening for might exist in a new form, that waiting, after long enough, could become arriving. The staff began discussing what that process might look like. Robert suggested a behavioral reintroduction protocol. Patrice offered to take point on coordinating with local families who had children. Emily asked whether she could remain involved directly. The answer to that one was obvious. The process took 3 weeks. It was not a dramatic transformation, no single breakthrough scene, no sudden flood of affection. That was not who Ghost was, but it was steady, and it moved in one direction. Emily began bringing recorded voices into the sessions, varied ages, varied registers. She worked with Robert to identify the vocal frequencies Ghost responded to most strongly. She spoke with the shelter's volunteer coordinator about arranging brief, supervised introductions with children whose families had expressed interest in adoption. Not as auditions, exactly, more as opportunities. 3 families came in over the course of 2 weeks. 2 children were calm and curious. One was loud and erratic, the kind of energetic 8-year-old whose presence filled every room instantly. Ghost retreated from that one, gently but clearly. The 3rd family arrived on a Thursday afternoon. A woman named Rachel and her daughter Lily, who was 6 years old and had the specific, unhurried quality of a child who was used to finding patience in small things. Lily did not rush to the cage. She let her mother guide her to the area outside Ghost's enclosure, and then she sat down on the floor cross-legged, at a distance, and did not reach or call or try to make anything happen. She hummed, very quietly. Emily, watching from near the door, wrote nothing in her notebook. She just watched. It took about 4 minutes. Then Ghost Cat rose from his corner and crossed the full length of his enclosure in a slow, deliberate walk that looked nothing like the hesitant edging Emily had been used to seeing. He walked to the front of the cage and pressed his nose against the bars. His tail moved in long, low arcs. He made no sound. He simply stood there and looked at the child. Lily looked back at him. After a long moment, she reached out one hand, very slowly, palm up, fingers open the way someone holds out a hand when they are offering something, not asking for it. Ghost pressed his forehead against her knuckles. It was the first time in 2 years that he had chosen to touch anyone. Emily became aware that she was holding her breath. Rachel, watching her daughter and the cat, put a hand over her mouth. Her eyes were bright. Lily didn't move and didn't speak. She just let the cat rest his head against her hand, and she stayed very still, the way a child does when something wild and true has come close, and they understand, somewhere below, thought. That stillness is the only correct response. He had not been chosen. He had chosen. After everything, 2 years of passing faces, 2 years of voices that weren't the right voice, 2 years of a trill sent out into a hallway that never answered. He had found the frequency that matched something real inside him, and he had moved toward it. The adoption was finalized 6 days later. Rachel and Lily brought a carrier with a soft gray lining. They brought a blanket that had been sitting near a window in their house for several days, carrying the smell of their home. The staff at Maplewood gathered in the hallway, the way people gather for small ceremonies, not making a fuss, exactly, but present, wanting to mark it. Ghost walked into the carrier on his own. The cage in room 3, the one near the east-facing window, stood empty for the first time in 2 years. One of the junior volunteers was assigned to clean it and prepare it for the next intake. She paused before she started, just briefly, looking at the worn fabric in the far corner where Ghost had always sat. The fabric was pressed down in a way that showed exactly where he had kept his weight every day for 730 mornings. She smoothed it out and started the cleaning process. In Rachel's house, the first weeks were measured and quiet. Ghost explored carefully, the way Siberians do, thorough, systematic, building a map. He identified the warm spots, the high points, the paths between rooms. He found the chair near the living room window and claimed it within 72 hours. He no longer made the low trill sound. Not the searching version, the one that had lived in the hallway at Maplewood like an unanswered question. That sound, which had once struck the shelter staff as eerie and uninterpretable, was simply gone. In its place, something quieter and easier. A soft sound when Rachel came home. A long, slow blink directed at Lily from across the room. And every night, without exception, when the house went still and Lily climbed into her bed and the lamp on the nightstand went out, Ghost Cat would cross the hallway from wherever he had settled and come to rest at the foot of the bed, not curled, not asleep, just present. On the third week, Rachel came in to check on Lily before going to bed herself, and she stopped in the doorway. Ghost had moved from the foot of the bed to Lily's side. He was lying with his body curved along the length of her arm, eyes half open in the dark, watching the door, watching for anything that might come in that shouldn't. On the fourth week, Emily received a photo and a message from Rachel. The photo showed Ghost sitting on the wide arm of the living room chair, in a patch of afternoon light. He was looking directly into the camera, not past it, not at something beyond the frame directly into it, with a clarity and presence that was almost startling to Emily after months of watching him look through people. She sat with the photo for a long time. She had spent a long time trying to understand what was broken in him, before she learned to look for what was whole. And what she had found, underneath 2 years of being misread, was not damage, it was devotion. A loyalty that had outlasted its original object and, after long enough, found somewhere new to land. The corner of the shelter is empty now. The cat who once sat there facing the same direction every morning, making sounds that no one understood, turning away from every outstretched hand, is not missing. He is exactly where he needs to be. He just needed someone to stop walking past long enough to ask the right question. And for the first time in 2 years, in a house on a quiet street across town, in the blue light just before dawn, when the world is at its most still, and every sound carries farther than it should, he is not calling for anyone.